Say what you mean what you say, don't say it mean. We don't necessarily want to solve the problem. We just want to be right. Women, we do tend to do that. Well, I don't mean to offend you, but, or I know I'm new here, but, or this may not be important, but. I always talk about a phrase I affectionately call the twins, and it's a two-part phrase. It's I noticed and I'm wondering. LOL, TMI, OMG, I can't understand what you're saying to me. The magic words are still thank you and please, even if you text or email with ease.
Welcome to Loud and Lifted, the Women in Leadership show where we trade fluff for practical tools. I'm your host, Betsy Ham. Today, we're talking about saying the hard things nicely. My guest, communications expert and best-selling author Sarita Maybin, built a career helping people say what you mean what you say, without being mean. In this conversation, Sarita breaks down her AIR framework, awareness, impact, request, shareable phrases that lower defenses, and the tiny wording swaps that protect your credibility. We'll hit listening under fire, body language triggers, yes, the finger wag. And if you've ever thought, I don't want to sound harsh, or I'm tired of being walked on, then this episode is for you. Let's get lifted. Sarita Maybin, welcome to Loud and Lifted. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, this is great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I had the pleasure a few weeks ago to hear you speak at a conference here in Pennsylvania, and you were about maybe 3 minutes, maybe five, we'll go into your presentation. I was like, wow, I need to have this woman on Loud and Lifted. You have this great platform where you're talking about communication, which is something we always need to be intentional about, but you have a different take. And you have written 2 books about this, about being nice. So how did you even come to this becoming your platform? And how did you decide you can still what you need to say, but say it in a nice way?
Well, you probably know from my bio that in my other life, I worked in university administration. And I worked at 4 different large state universities in that other career. And one of the things I noticed is that miscommunication was rampant. It just seemed that people weren't addressing things, or if it was uncomfortable, they would just ghost you. Nothing would get done because they didn't want to have the difficult conversation. And so I started realizing that sometimes we just have to suck it up and say, hey, you know what, let's just talk and get this straightened out. So it was kind of always haunting me during that. And then so when I started as a speaker, I realized it was not just in the state university arena, it was everywhere, that even at home,
right,
that we're not saying what we need to say. And so my mantra in life, or my motto, I guess, became say what you mean what you say, don't say it mean. And
love that.
I know that's not grammatically correct, but that's kind of my mantra. We can still say what we need to say, but don't have to be ugly about it.
Absolutely. And you know what? You're right. No matter what your role is, no matter what your age is, we all deal with this. We all have those tough conversations that we don't want to have, or we have to be maybe have to be confrontational. And we just sometimes struggle with going about that. And, I think especially as women, sometimes if you don't have the right approach, you might be called some certain names. So let's talk about that framework with really when it comes down to those tough truths with tact. How do you approach a conversation? Like, what's that go-to structure for a hard conversation while you still feel like you're being respectful?
Well, I always say that the number one thing is to keep in mind that the person may not know there's an issue. I always say give them the benefit of the doubt. And it's interesting to me because I remember one time a woman came to me in one of my keynotes, after my keynote, she says, Sarita, I think my coworker's laying awake at night plotting my demise. And those were her actual words, which are shocking. And I said, no, I suspect you're laying awake at night. She's probably sleeping soundly. And after we talked a bit, she was like, yeah, I guess the woman really doesn't even know there's an issue. So my framework starts with, awareness. I have an acronym AIR, A-I-R, and the A stands for awareness. Are they even aware of the fact that there's a problem? And sometimes we have to say, hey, I don't know if you realize, but here's what I'm seeing. And we might have to start there. And then the I is impact. When you do this, here's what I'm seeing the result of that is. And then the R is, of course, requesting something different. We can't always assume that people know what to do. We always say, well, surely they must know. But no, maybe they don't know. So A for awareness, I for impact, and P and R rather for request, AIR.
Oh, I love that. That's so simple and so easy. And you're so right. I've certainly been in that situation where you're feeling really bothered by the way someone's talking to you, or maybe they're not talking to you, and they might not realize it. It's not always malicious. We're all doing a million things and we're,
Yeah.
having lots of conversations. So I just being aware is
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
And it
exactly.
sounds so
And giving
simple,
people
right?
giving people the benefit of the doubt, I think, is really a good place to start. To assume that they
Absolutely.
don't have negative intentions.
Sure. So if you do that and you start to create this dialogue with somebody, like where do people tend to go wrong? Like, is it the tone? Is it the timing? Is it the wording? Where do we trip up?
Sometimes we trip up by immediately blaming the other person, and I feel like sometimes that comes out, in our language. We say, "Well, you never,"
Mm.
or "You always," or "You better," and I always say that's like the finger wagging
Oh, yeah.
conversation, or the finger wagging approach. And I think, I hate to say this, we do that sometimes more at home than we do at work. And I remember years ago, someone said to me that home is where we go when we're tired of being
Mm.
nice. And we try all these perfect phrases at work and in our businesses, and then we go home and we're like, "You better," and then we go into the ugly finger wag mode.
Oh, that's so true. I definitely might be guilty of that with my husband and my children. We're not going to like admit that to them. So hopefully I don't hear this, but that's true. You just almost run out of patience by the time you get home, and you kind of let your guard down and don't
Yeah,
always have that right tone or approach, and definitely don't seek to understand that might be an issue.
exactly,
I'm telling all my own
exactly.
issues.
No,
So,
I think we all have the same issues.
right. Absolutely. Is there a time in these situations where you decide to address it or just let it go? Or do you feel like you always address it?
I remember someone told me years ago that the definition of resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And so we're basically over here going, "Can't believe they're doing this." We're like dying over here. And really, it's almost like, I always say the clue is like when you have to interact with that person or run across that person, and you feel yourself tensing up and just bracing yourself like, "Oh goodness, I have to talk to them." So in other words, you're taking that poison, the proverbial poison,
Right.
and it's starting to affect your attitude. And you're starting to feel some angst, feel some kind of way about that person. For me, that's always a clue that maybe I need to just have a conversation, because every time I see them, I'm just like,
Sure. And I guess that's a great point, because if you literally can't let it go, right? We have those times where we're really stewing on something, we can't move on. Well, that definitely needs to be addressed. You can't let that continue to poison you. I love that.
yes, yes, exactly.
So I love the air. That was a great concept. So when you're starting those conversations, is there any like good conversation starters? Is there a way to address that you feel like you're not attacking somebody?
I think again it comes down to the wording.
Yeah.
I always feel like the we wording, and set, the we together wording, as opposed to the you, again, finger wagging wording.
Mhm.
And so sometimes I find myself saying, "Let's talk, because I'd like to figure out how we can move forward. We seem to be at a stalemate," or something like that. So I use the let's, or my favorite one is, "How can we resolve this?"
Ooh.
And some of these, you as you saw in my presentation, I do my top 10 positive communication phrases. And I love talking about the questions. Would you be willing to hear some feedback? That's one of my phrases. Or how can we resolve this is another phrasing. So sometimes starting out with, would you consider some feedback? Or let's talk about this. What would you be willing to have a conversation? Or would you consider some new ideas? So I love the phrasing, because it
Yep.
keeps us from being in that pushing mode.
Pushing.
It's more like a we mode.
Yeah, I love that it's collaborative and you're not accusing anybody of anything right there. So you're trying to like, let's be proactive, let's solve this. I guess really it's just being problem solvers versus just accusing someone. What
Yeah,
are some of
yeah,
those
and I
other
love the
ones
way
on
you
that
put
list?
that, problem solvers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key. And sometimes I really think that's funny that you should use the term problem solvers, because I feel like in our heart of hearts, sometimes we really just want to be right.
Well,
We don't necessarily want to solve the problem. We just want to be right.
right.
And I remember someone said years ago, you can have a relationship or you can be right.
Mm.
And I'm thinking, oh, but I really, really want to be right. So, but that sometimes flies in the face of having a relationship. And so looking at, how can we work together to resolve this? Or as you say, problem solving focus, instead of, I'm going to show them the error of their
That
ways.
they're wrong.
That,
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. We sometimes like to prove that people are wrong, certain people, but that's
yeah,
not going to be problem solving or definitely proactive.
yeah, yeah,
And it's funny because
exactly.
you always hear that line, like, choose your battles, right? So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, and I think of that personally and professionally, there's been times where it's like, you know what, this might not be the one that I'm going to like fall on the sword for, but let's figure out
Exactly.
how to have the conversation and be productive about it versus causing like some major confrontation.
Yeah. And if we fight every battle, we would just be exhausted. I mean, some battles are not, worthy of our energy.
Right, exactly. Does anything change in that approach? And I'm assuming not, but just want to make sure when, say, this is your boss that you kind of have to push back on, or, we'll go problem solving still. But how does that work when you're dealing with a superior?
Oh, I love that question. Reminds me of a woman who asked me one time, Sarita, how do you pull rank when you have no rank to pull? And I just thought, boy, that's just like the best question ever, because so often we are trying to address things and we really have no rank or any authority. And really, sometimes that's even with our colleagues. And then, of course, as you say, more so when we go up the chain to a supervisor. And I think, again, the question format, if we're saying to the boss, we might have some issues about some things happening in the department, we would never go to them and say, I need to talk to you about some things that need to be fixed. That's
No.
not going to get a good response, but we might instead say, would you be open to hearing some ideas I have about some things in the department that we can change? So again, would you be open to? Would you consider? What do you think about? So it's the question format that allows us to soften it, and then of course go up the chain. Yeah, I think that's my go-to strategy
Yeah,
probably for a lot of things. What do you
that
think
makes sense.
about? Would it be possible to? Would you consider? So.
Those are great. And it's funny because, we talk about like seeking to understand, which sometimes I think can come across a little snarky depending on how you approach that. But
Yeah.
those are, again, they're collaborative, they're problem solving, and they seem like you're being positive versus sometimes I think seeking to understand can be a little snarky, or maybe it's just the way I say it. I don't know.
Well, it's funny that I love the fact that you address the fact that it's how we say it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll when I share my phrases, my favorite top 10 phrases, people will push back against some of the phrases. And one that gets a lot of pushback is a favorite phrase of mine, which is I would appreciate. I would say to someone, I'd appreciate you giving me a heads up next time. Like if somebody's dropped something on you at
Yep.
the 11th hour, hey, I'd appreciate you giving me a heads up or maybe a couple days notice. That's to say I would appreciate is very different than, well, I would appreciate. Because
Right.
now we've got our hand on our hip and we're doing all this nonverbal ugliness.
Yep.
So it's sometimes that snarky tone, as you say, or it's even that the body thing when we get into our little attitude, then that kind of ruins everything.
That's a great point. And so you bring up the physical piece of this. What are some of those things that are going to trigger people, or what are some of the things that we can do to make sure that we're not, getting people on the defense?
Yeah, and you've seen me demonstrate one of them, which I was talking about the proverbial finger pointing, the wagging the finger like this. But I'm always shocked that I see people in conversations actually literally, wagging their finger in somebody's face. I just thought of a story. I don't share this story much, but I remember when I worked in the university arena, I had a woman who was a colleague. She was a department director as I was. But I always say she thought she was the boss of me. And so she was forever trying to dictate how I should run my department. And I remember one day she did a little finger wag. And I said to her, I appreciate you not pointing your finger. And she puffed. And then the funniest thing happened. This is the weirdest thing. The next time she talked to me, she goes, but it was almost like you could see her struggling, like a metamorphosis was occurring right before my very eyes that she was trying to, because clearly that finger wagging had been her MO for
Sure.
like many years. And when I called her out on it, it's like the next time it was like she didn't know what to do with herself. It's like,
Right.
oh, well, but I appreciated the effort. I
Sure.
appreciated the fact that she was open to not, really like putting her finger in my face when she talked, because that's obviously something that will turn people off when we do that.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, when someone is talking to us and we're doing this whole arm, you've heard the closed body posture with the arms folded. That's a clear signal to people that you're saying, oh, I don't want to hear it. So
Right.
On both sides of the fence, I think there's
True.
some offenses that we do non-verbally.
Absolutely. And even like that sitting back really far in your chair, whether you're on a Teams meeting or you're in a conference room, or turning away from the person. I think it's easy to kind of show how you're putting up that wall if you don't
That's
like the
right.
way someone is communicating or what they're saying. But it's funny that you mentioned the finger pointing. And I had a boss who did that early on in the career. And hers wasn't so much in your face, but like she'd be in a meeting going like this a lot. And to your point, she didn't realize what kind of impact that had on her team. So somehow, somewhere along the line, somebody was like, Kim, you got to stop. Well, she knows. So I'll call her out on this. She was my first podcast guest, but like, you have to stop doing this. Like this is, and she was like, oh my gosh, I don't mean that. So there was a time, as we maybe called her out once or twice, but then she would catch herself and be like,
yeah, exactly.
So, sometimes it's that awareness of how you're showing up.
Well, and that's exactly right. In fact, going back to the AIR, awareness, impact, and request, that's a perfect example of the A, that the person giving them the benefit of the doubt, maybe they didn't realize that. And sometimes you have to say, hey, if you realize it, when you're in the meeting and you're pointing like that, sometimes that'll come across as a little overbearing. Sure. But I don't know if you realize that it's coming across that way. It's probably not your intention. But certainly it may be interpreted that way. So we're giving them the benefit of the doubt that maybe they don't know that this little thing or whatever it is.
Whatever it is. So speaking of intention, I think sometimes, and especially women, I'm going to be a little stereotypical, try to do things that they think are going to sound nicer or soften it. And some of them that I think of is like, oh, to be honest, or no offense, or maybe they'll say something like, oh, I'm just kidding, after they hear it come out. So what do we do about that, right? Like, what if that's one of our little crutches that we do to soften things? Is that a good approach? And if not, how do we replace that?
I love that you use the word crutch. It is a crutch because we're leaning to that. We're leaning on it as a way to maybe make it easier or more comfortable for us.
Yep.
Unfortunately, though, when we qualify, those are qualifiers. If we use those qualifiers, that tends to rob us of our authority. And sometimes even makes us come across as more negative.
Sure.
And as women, we do tend to do that. Well, I don't mean to offend you, but, or I know I'm new here, but, or I just, this may not be important, but, anytime we lead into something with a qualifier, it just tends to be, as you say, a crutch, but then it also is crippling.
Sure.
To use that analogy.
Yeah,
absolutely. Crippling in terms of our authority.
Yeah. And there's so much in communication. And it's funny, I just had this conversation the other day where even if we're in a meeting and we think we have a good idea, but we put that like, well, I'm not sure if this is a good idea, or this might be dumb, or I was thinking, and then you say your idea, you just killed your credibility. So there's that piece of it too, where we're putting those precursors on words when we're going to give an idea, or when we want to give feedback, it kills the credibility, makes people stop believing in what you're saying.
And what's interesting too is the other side of that on the end. Sometimes we put things on the end, like, I think we need to move forward with this project, okay? Or I think this will be a great idea for our department. You think? And so we again rob ourselves of our authority. Sure. and kind of push ourselves down as we put those on the back end as well. We're saying, well, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just, thinking through my career, I just feel like this is something that women struggle with so much, where it's either it's too nice and you're doing the softening, or you're coming in hot, right? Like all the time you're coming in hot, and then you get that reputation for being the B word or being aggressive or whatever it is. And so it's like, how do you balance that? Like, how do you find that middle ground where you're being nice, you're saying what you mean, but you're saying it in a nice way?
And and I think there's a tiny, tiny adjustment that we can make that will change everything. And it's the difference between saying, you need to be here on time, which comes across as very aggressive. And sometimes men get away with that, but women definitely not. When you say, you need to do this, that's going to be, like you say, the total B word if we come across like that. And so flipping that, and I hate to say this is really like assertiveness 101, but it's like flipping that, I need you to be here on time versus you need to be here on time. Oh. I need to be here, or you always show up late, or I need you to not be late. So taking the responsibility by saying I need, or we would prefer that you do this versus you never do this, or you always do something else. So it's the we and the I wording versus the you, and again, the blaming, finger pointing, the proverbial finger pointing wording. Yep. I think that allows us to say things in a nice way, but we're still firm and fair about it, but still in a nice way.
No, that's such a great point. When you use you, it better be like, oh, you're awesome or something very positive. You can say if you're going to give a compliment, you're amazing, you're great, teammate, whatever it is, but you say you're and it's not positive, it literally just is going to put people back
Yeah,
like, oh, why
yeah.
is she attacking me?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about you're awesome. I love that because, yeah, we can say that in a positive way, but if we say, in a negative way, like you're a slacker,
Right.
that's probably not a good thing to say.
Probably not. Yeah. Only accuse them of being great, not being
Yes,
negative.
exactly. I
That's
have
funny.
to say, when I talk about phrases and I talk about giving people the benefit of the doubt, and I say, oh, you may not be aware,
Mm.
or perhaps you didn't realize, this is what we need. Sometimes people say, well, Sarita, I thought you said you can't say you. But when it's in a description, perhaps you're not aware or maybe you didn't know, that's very different
Sure.
than saying you clearly are clueless.
Right.
So it's not a blaming kind of mode. It's just a describing a situation of, again, benefit of the doubt. Perhaps you didn't know about this.
That's a great point. That makes total
So
sense.
the word you itself is not forbidden. It's just when you use it in a blaming mode.
Right.
And I love the fact that you point out that, you're awesome, you rock. We can say you all day long.
Say that all day. Okay, so the other half of communication is listening. So how do we be better listeners? How do we listen to what's said without getting defensive and looking for the truth? What are your top listening mistakes and what do we do to fix them?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that everyone has heard the Stephen Covey wisdom about listening to understand. And a lot of times we just listen to wait to respond.
Yep.
And obviously we don't want to do that. But I get the best advice I've ever received. One of my first mentors, I was a grad student many years ago, and one of my first mentors said, Sarita, when you get some negative things, ask for more. And I say that because we can listen all day long when it's positive, but the minute someone says something we don't want to hear, suddenly our listening skills go out the window and we're just thinking, how can I defend myself here?
Right.
But she said, when you get some negative feedback, ask for more. And I thought that was great feedback because sometimes we'll hear something, especially if we're in a leadership role and we hear something from an employee or staff member or even a customer who may say, well, I don't like this, and they're complaining. Our first instinct is to explain and defend.
Yep.
And instead of doing that, just saying, tell me more, or can you elaborate, or can you give me some examples? And that's a great way to listen, even in the face of some negative feedback, because I think that's when listening is hard, when someone is sharing something that we don't want to hear.
Totally. This is probably something that I've had to work on through the years. I'm not claiming I'm amazing at it, but it's so easy if someone's giving you feedback that maybe you don't agree with, or maybe you're not even listening. You don't want to be curious. You just want to defend, right? So I can think of countless times where I went in defense mode and I probably escalated it and made it worse because I got defensive and then they kind of, nobody's listening, everyone's talking and it's just not productive. So it's like being curious then kind of opens that and gets you further into the conversation.
I love that. Being curious. That's a great way to put it. Being curious.
Yeah. Because it's real easy to get defensive, at least for me. So if I'm getting feedback, right, that I don't agree with, what are some of those, how do I ask questions? How do I be curious without also sounding like, because again, I got to balance being snarky. You can tell there's a theme here where that can happen. So how do I ask you for, further info?
Yeah. Some of my favorite phrases, my favorite go-to phrase is, how do you mean? When someone will say something. So for example, I love telling the story about how I went to a professional development seminar when I worked at the university for supervisors, and they said, go back and ask your employees in your one-on-one meetings for their input. I thought, that sounds like a great idea. So I go back, and in my first one-on-one meeting, I said, well, what do you think we can do to improve the department? And he said, you can be a better supervisor. And I literally was ready to defend myself. And instead I said, how do you mean? And, he gave me some great feedback. I could have said, tell me more. Can you elaborate? Can you be more specific? Can you give me some examples? But what's going to happen? The tone and how we say it and our facial expression is going to be a make or break, because we can say, well, can you elaborate? Like we're really challenging them, and really we don't want it to come off as a challenge, but more as you say, a curiosity.
Right. Yeah. Because give me some examples. That can come across real hot for sure. Well, give me some examples. When did I suck?
Exactly. Give me some examples.
Yeah. How do you mean? I like that. I have not used that, but I'm going to put that on my list. That's a good, I feel like I can use that with my teenage daughters too, right? Like they're good with some kind of quick comeback.
It's funny, when my daughter's grown now, but when she was a teenager, her favorite thing was whatever. And I would call her out. I would say, you say whatever, but what does that mean? Or you say whatever, but I'm not sure what do you mean by that. Like, in other words, it forced her to have to explain in a different way and not just get away with saying whatever. And now I could have guessed 10 different things I was probably that she meant, but to call her out
Yep.
on it forced her to say it in a different way rather than getting away with being snarky.
Sure.
So,
That's a great life lesson because that can
yeah,
become a
so
bad
that,
habit of just shutting down the conversation and
mm-hmm,
moving on versus like, okay, let's push them to engage. And maybe they're right. Like maybe they have a good point. So make them communicate it and explain it. I love that. That's a good challenge.
yeah.
I just get the like eye roll and the, turn away.
Mm-hmm.
That's what my team's like too.
I always talk about a phrase I affectionately call the twins, and it's a two-part phrase. It's I noticed and I'm wondering.
Mm,
And I feel like that's a great phrase for calling people out. I noticed you rolled your eyes and I'm wondering what's going on. Or I noticed you went, and I'm wondering what that means. And I've used that in meetings when someone kind of has a negative response or an attitude about something that's been said in the meeting. I might say, I noticed that you sighed when we mentioned that project, and I'm wondering what's going on.
You're not accusing them, so there's no reason to get defensive. And maybe they will a little bit if they totally messed something up or forgot to do something, but you're just kind of keeping it open and trying to
Yeah.
understand. Oh, that's so good. Let's talk a little bit about the high-tech times. This was in one of your books. So how do we handle communication when it comes to emails or Slack or Teams and what to do, especially emails, right? Because that can be very challenging to communicate sometimes. So what's your approach for that?
Okay, you're setting me up, Betsy, for doing a little ditty that I love to do,
Please.
which I think is going to summarize my whole 2 cents worth on high tech. But here we go. LOL, TMI, OMG, I can't understand what you're saying to me. The magic words are still thank you and please, even if you text or email with ease. Bold and all caps are email attitude, and texting while we're talking is just rude. You can't say something nice. What do you say? Whatever it is, don't post it on Facebook today.
Oh my
That's my
God, that's
whole
awesome.
2 cents worth in 30 seconds.
I love that. That's so good. Okay, well, I think that answered all the questions.
Yeah, that just answers. I figure that answers all the questions in
Right,
the
right.
shortest possible time. But seriously, though, I do laugh because I have colleagues who will say, "Yeah, I had a conversation with some people that I was going to be meeting with, or some people I was going to be speaking to, and then I get there on site, and they go, "Oh, you're very warm and friendly, or you're very nice, or you're actually pleasant," and you're thinking, "What in the world were they thinking about me when we were emailing?" Because the warm and fuzziness gets lost in the emails. And so that's where I always say, please and thank you. Because if you say to someone, hey, please let me know if you're going to need anything else, or thank you so much for your time. I always say we should do a kindness check
Hmm.
in our emails. And a kindness check is looking to see, is there a please or a thank you somewhere in
Hmm.
the email? Because it's a great way to soften it and make it more approachable. So not
I
so
love that.
cold and sterile.
Do you ever think it's appropriate to have a tough conversation via email?
I personally don't prefer that. And of course, now we're all working remotely and people are not always in the same office. But I always feel like at least a phone conversation
Sure.
and maybe using the email to set it up and say, hey, I have some things I'd love to chat with you about and let's schedule a time. This kind of format via Zoom, now we have this option. In the
Right.
earlier years, it was a phone call was always my recommendation, but now we can even do this kind of. But I think it's good to see the nuances, and in a regular email, that's totally missed. Even the please and thank you will not save you as far as a difficult
Sure.
conversation. So,
Agree. And it's funny too, because you're right. You compare email to the phone. And yeah, if it's anything other than informational or something that's friendly, then probably shouldn't be email. But then I even think about when I've had a difficult conversation, phone versus Teams or, something with video, it's real easy to hide behind a phone. I mean, it's not easy, it's easier. But then when you
yeah,
have to see someone, I think there's a lot of benefit to that because then they can see your impressions, they can see your face, you can see theirs, you can see how they're reacting,
exactly.
which I think can help. Some people get really uncomfortable with that. And I understand that. But I think that's kind of that challenge of if it's really difficult, then you probably should be looking them in the eye as much as you can.
Exactly. And some people will argue and say, well, I like email because then I can document
Mm.
everything. But now I'm going to have to hark back to the dark ages before the internet. I mean, I remember sending memos when I was a dean of students for a short time in my other life. One of my many jobs, my final job before I left higher ed, and as a dean of students, I often had to deal with discipline cases, people who had done things that were not against they were against the rules. And that was one of those things where, we'd have the conversation, but I was forever sending, following up our
Mhm.
memo, following up our conversation. And I think email can be used that way.
Yep.
We can have a Teams meeting, or you have something like this where you're face to face, but then sending the email to say, just to follow up, here's the things that we agreed upon,
Yes,
and use the email as the old school memo, just
absolutely.
to follow up our conversation format.
No, I'm a big fan of that. I've done that many times because to your point, it doesn't have to be recapping every, every piece of the conversation you had, but it's like that this is what we agreed upon. This is the
That's
next
right.
steps. Because sometimes you have a great conversation and maybe it was productive and then you walk away and you're both not on the same page. So just sort
That's
of
right.
documenting like this is what we agreed to, this is what you're going to do, so I'm going to do. Here's the timeline. Then there helps to eliminate the miscommunication. So I'm a big fan of, yes, have the conversation in person and it doesn't have to be an HR style documented email, but at least ensuring that you're all on the same page when you walk away. And then it is documented.
Yes,
So there's
yes,
that part.
exactly. And I think even in my the last 20 some years or so as a speaker, I'm in a lot of conversations with people who are in a different geographic location,
Mm.
and I find myself using email even when it's not a difficult conversation saying, as we agreed, we'll meet up here, at this point we'll go do the book signing,
Yep,
or we'll go here. And so I'm just confirming the details just to make sure that there's no confusion, even when it's not a difficult
absolutely.
conversation.
No, that's huge. I I need to see things in writing. So give me
Yeah.
the stuff in
Yeah.
writing because I might have spaced out on the conversation part. So
Exactly. And me
well,
too. It's like a memory lapse if I don't have it written down somewhere.
absolutely. I need to write down everything. And my handwriting, I am reminded earlier today that is atrocious. So I need it like somebody to type it or I need to type it. So we're on the same page and it's legible. Well, this is awesome. And we could probably talk about this all day. So any final takeaways for our listeners to be able to deliver those tough messages, to have the uncomfortable conversations, but how do you be nice and mean what you say?
Yeah, I think I would just close with what we started out with, which is the motto of say what you mean what you say, but it doesn't have to be mean. That there is a lot of I think a lot of latitude in between saying nothing and
Mm.
being ugly. So just remembering that we can still say things and do that in a positive way.
That's great. And I love your 10 power phrases. We'll definitely share that when this episode goes out because it's nice to see that and kind of just look at it every once in a while and be like, oh, hey, I'm struggling. What do I need to do here? So that's awesome. So, Sarita, if people want to follow you, learn more about you, find your books, where can they connect with you?
Yeah, well, Amazon is the best bet, and I'm excited because I've had a chance to narrate both my books, and they're both on
Ooh,
Audible. So there's paperback, Kindle, and Audible. So
nice.
whatever format you prefer, it's all three of those. And then of course, SaritaMaybin.com is my website, and you can certainly connect with me there. And one of the things I should also mention is on the homepage of my website, you can sign up to get my monthly "What Do You Say" communique.
Ooh.
And so once a month, I send out a communication tip, and that's a great way to stay connected as well.
And a great way to be reminded of how to be a better communicator. I will be signing up for that today for sure. That's amazing.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been super helpful. And thanks for getting loud and lifted with us. Thank you to Sarita for sharing her expertise with us. Whether it's communicating in the office or in your home, it's important to take a step back and evaluate how we are speaking. If your messages don't seem to be received by the way you're intending, then it's worth a deeper dive into your style, your words, your choices, and your delivery. If this helped, share it with a woman leader who's navigating a hard conversation today. Subscribe, leave a quick review, and grab more resources at loudandlifted.com. Until next time, stay loud in a nice way and keep lifting.